recording begins. It is October 29th, ESM 105. Thank you all for making it today. We are here in week 10, all right, doing our ecological economics PowerPoint. There's a quiz 4 of 6. You have 6 total quizzes in this semester, and then the final, which is structured just like one of these quizzes. This is the last quiz where you've got a reading assigned. This quiz is covering Stuff, The Secret Life of Everyday Things, which is hopefully a nice, fun, short read for you after those big, dense ones earlier in the semester. Don't forget about the annotated bibliography. Please continue to do that. Don't forget about the discussions that open up every Friday. Continue to do those. Just accrue points, you know? Why not? Just get an A in ESM 105. Might as well, huh? Cool. Are there any questions before we get started in the lecture? Okay. So for people watching the recording, I know you can't see the screen, we are on slide 9 of the Ecological Economics PowerPoint, carbon markets. So we ended last time talking about trading in the carbon market. All right, what are carbon credits? It usually represents either you've avoided emission or you've actively fixed a metric ton of atmospheric carbon. And remember, measuring carbon's a good metric for trying to mitigate other negative environmental impacts of development, industry, etc. However, there's also trading markets for other pollutants, which we'll look at very briefly in just a moment. So there are entities that give out these carbon credits, okay? And there are other entities which rank these carbon credits in their quality. So you can have high quality carbon credits, low quality carbon credits, based on some basic criteria. Oh, let me really quickly. When this says on the top of the slide, avoiding emission or fixing 1 metric ton, you can fix carbon by growing plants, for example, right? You could fix carbon by taking a volatile form of carbon and converting it into a more stable form of carbon. So I worked for a while with the biochar industry, tangentially doing research for them. And one of the benefits of biochar is you could take something like yard waste, green waste, stuff that's going to decompose rapidly or be shipped to a dump sometimes, and instead of letting it decay and release all that carbon into the atmosphere, you burn it in the absence of oxygen, and this at a very high temperature, and this generates a stable form of carbon, which is carbon fixation, right? But then there's questions of, do you let that industry enter into the carbon credit market? And then how do you rate using different feedstocks? I'm just trying to give you some things to think about here. Like, is turning a pile of lawn clippings into biochar the same as turning a tree into biochar? What if that tree was previously destined to be lumber, which would be decaying much more slowly than the yard waste? All things to think about in how complicated this sort of market could rapidly become. Alrighty. So this is, I forget what the IC is, International Carbon or something like that. But this is one set of guidelines developed by a third party that rates carbon credit qualities. And it includes things like governance and emissions impact. There's a term here that I think would be fun for you to have moving forward, because I think you're all ESM majors, right? In the room? Yes? No. We got a couple of non-ESM majors, that's right. Forestry? Yeah. So at the very least, I know, because I teach other ESM classes, that the term additionality is going to come up, and it's a fun term, okay? I know I mentioned it on Monday, but it might come up in your other majors as well, okay? So does the conservation project has outcomes that you project. You say, oh, the conservation project, setting up this nature preserve, building this light rail system, whatever we're doing, okay, is going to reduce carbon emissions. But would the carbon emissions have happened if the project had never happened? That's the concept of additionality. A good conservation project has high additionality, where it's actually adding to the conservation effort. Instead of, well, we set up a nature preserve, but it's just, it was a de facto nature preserve anyways. Now there's legislation protecting it, but there was not going to be developed before regardless. That would be a low additionality. I just want to open it up. Do we have any questions about that term, additionality? Because it's a good one. It's something to think about. Okay. If you take ESM 230, which I think most folks will be taking it, you will get introduced more into this concept, and you'll look at actual data sets and compare the impact of projects versus the projected impact if the project had not proceeded. It's an important thing to think about, but we don't have to dwell on it for too much longer. In fact, we can stop dwelling on it right now. All right, emissions trading, okay? So we've talked about carbon credits. Carbon-containing compounds are a major pollutant or a major byproduct of industry. It's something that you emit a lot of. You burn fossil fuels, yeah, you're emitting carbon-containing compounds, all right? Carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide if it's not burning cleanly, etc. Okay, cool. Now, cap and trade trading, okay? Or the concept of cap and trade. It's something you might have heard of. You cap one thing that the industry produces, all right? You say, you cannot make more than this level of sulfur-containing pollutants, all right? And that's your cap. And then there's trade of, well, we exceeded, but we undercut. We got underneath the level that we could go. Can we trade our emissions levels, right? Can we, hey, how's it going? Can we shift some from this company to this company because we emitted less sulfur, we emitted more, it all levels out at the end. So you've got a cap to the levels, a cap to the pollution levels, and then you've got a trade in those pollution levels. It's just like what we were talking about with the carbon credit system in principle. Fair enough? But this can work with other things. So there are companies that you could, if you just do a Google search for like carbon credits or like, I want to generate carbon credits, there are companies which will give or sell or create carbon credits for the market based on changes that you make to your lifestyle, or if you have physical resources like land, changes that you make to the land management. It's shocking. And there's like 7 of them, and they're all sponsored, results on Google, and there's other ones below. So it's a whole market. It's a market that's become a little inundated. The carbon market has sort of flatlined in how many carbon credits are actually being traded, and people hold them, they exist, but they've leveled off in the creation of new carbon credits and the actual trading, selling, and buying of those carbon credits. So, yeah, it's great. So here we go, 1990 Clean Air Act, reduction in sulfur dioxide, all right? You get one thing, and people focus on it and say, okay, well, sulfur dioxide emissions are leading to acid rain. Acid rain is, remember our concept of the flagship species? Back when we were talking about conservation of habitats, you get a charismatic species. Well, in a kind of sick way, acid rain's like a charismatic outcome of pollution, okay? You hear acid rain, and it's like, I don't want that to happen. What do we do to stop that, right? There are other outcomes. You hear eutrophication, and you're like, God, I want to learn a new word. Right? I know the word acid, and I know the word rain. I don't want acid coming down from the skies. All right, so this was pretty darn successful. Sulfur exchange, okay? Sulfur cap and trade market. You cap the emissions of sulfur dioxide, and you allow industries to trade. You keep lowering the caps, and that leads to an adoption of technologies to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions, okay? So there are still places that are buying credits. There are still hot spots of pollution that are buying credits in order to continue producing sulfur dioxide, but it's an overall reduction that's occurred. There are a bunch of different pollutants traded, and actually, we talked about this after class last time. These are international markets, all right? So remember our concept of externalities, and remember the phrase of toxic colonialism, where you took your externalities and you put them into the international market, into another area that has more lax restrictions. Well, there can be trade of pollution credits in international markets, which could lead to the same sorts of issues. All things to consider while you're thinking about these markets. So a lot of reductions, a lot of trading, okay? There's emissions payments, all right? 4 countries make up most of them, and about 2/3 of the payments that are given out for reductions, okay, come from the destruction of this refrigerant HFC 23. It was a real big deal when I was young. You know, everybody was talking about these hydrofluorocarbons, right? Maybe you heard that being thrown around still. And it's a refrigerant, and it helps to keep things cool. And keeping things cool is really important, but using this refrigerant is negative and not. It's really harmful to the environment. So destruction of that hydrofluorocarbon can get you credits. Yes. I am not positive, actually, of how it interacts in the atmosphere after its reaction. Yeah. I don't want that. See, hydrofluoric acid rain would also be a good phrase to get, or hydrofluoric acid gas. I'd be like, yeah, bone melt gas. There we go. Yeah, we're doing BMG reductions right now. No more bone melt gas. Yeah. So so this is interesting. Sometimes one aspect will become dominant in the reductions here. People are literally destroying this compound by burning it, and doing so in a way that is supposed to be better than if it had been used, but you're still burning this compound, right? So how do you destroy it? Can you sequester it? Where do you get the credits? Who's giving the credits? What's the quality of the credits? Who's buying the credits? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, please.
I feel like there's a direct correlation between amount of credits available in a nation's system and the nation's emissions.
Yeah. If you have higher emissions, then they're gonna, yeah.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound.
Absolutely. And these the introduction of these markets are correlated with reductions in emissions, and it could just be because of the complication of participating in these markets that are very volatile. I, as a company, don't want to begin trading in this market of emissions credits because I know that prices shift, and then from year to year, my credits might become useless. So maybe instead of even participating in that not very stable market, I just say, fine, I'm just gonna reduce my damn emissions. Awesome. So here's some criticism slides, okay? It's a new market. So when there's a new market and there's new trading, people who are schooled, way more schooled than me in economics, are the ones who are going to benefit a lot from participating in these markets. You see what I'm saying right here? So large scale, large industries that have capital to throw around, and specialists who understand how to utilize this market to realize maximum benefit, all right, end up doing very well. Even though the initial idea was we want to encourage a shift over to cleaner energy solutions because we're going to introduce a cost to using the less clean technologies. And that's the real idea behind this whole ecological economics PowerPoint, this whole lecture, right? Is that if you impose a cost for polluting, then people will pollute less in the market because that is a cost. Unless they can pay the fee. You want to make the fee so
it's only illegal for poor people.
Yeah. it definitely becomes if you have enough capital, you can just pay all the fees. And we talked about it a little bit on Monday of how smaller groups or smaller smaller companies even, can't compete with larger companies because they can't suffer the short-term losses for these sort of regulations as they are imposed. I've got new regulations. Maybe they're going to go away. You're convinced they're going to go away or the costs are going to be reduced, but you can't wait the 10 years that you need to or the 4 years that you need to for the regulations, the caps to be adjusted. All right. I love it. So we talked very briefly classical economics, discussing what is capital, what are resources technically, and then in the very brief, very basic overview, we move from classical economics to neoclassical economics. This is a quote from one of the founders of neoclassical economics, Keynes. You've heard of Keynesian economics. Keynes said that capitalism was the astounding belief that the most wickedest of all of men will do the most wickedest of things for the greatest good of everyone. It's a pretty good quote, and it's from somebody who is still referenced regularly and credited with modern schools of economic thought, like Keynesian economics. So we've got sort of two broad camps of modern neoclassical economics. We have discussions of political economy, which is the idea of who has political power, okay? Who has political power, and that economy. The shifting and the moving and the trading of influence and power over others, power over what you can do. How do we trade that? So this is an idea. These are political economy discussions. They deal with structures and relationships among classes, all right? And it's a little more focused on philosophies, all right? And the idea that if you're accruing capital, if you allow the accrual of capital by individuals, that will inevitably lead to inequality. And then we've got the neoclassical economics, the camp that is just called neoclassical economics, all right, which uses more, it attempts to remove values from the discussion in its framing. So the people who framed this school of thought said, we're going to remove all of the value statements about which markets are good, which markets are bad, where we don't care where the money is, who has it. We just are going to focus on here's how we allow trade, and then we look at the outcomes of it. All right? So this maintains focuses on the supply and demand basics and as I mentioned on Monday, I'm not an economist, which you can probably tell. So this is a very surface level covering of this. But in these neoclassical economics, if you want a bullet point for it, it's an objective, value-free approach to economics, all right? Which is not what we're trying to work with when we talk about ecological economics, okay? So in neoclassical economics, we talk about growth. Growth needs to be constant, all right? You constantly need to be growing economies. You constantly need to be growing markets. You constantly need to be growing populations. Everything needs to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And if something starts to become scarce, well, we're dealing with a value-free system. So if one thing becomes scarce, the market will find something to replace that thing that became scarce. And then deplete that one, and then we'll find another thing that becomes scarce. And don't worry, technology will take care of everything, all right? Once we run out of space, we'll find more space. We'll go underground, or we'll build floating cities. Don't worry about it. No problem. So this is another one of these systems approaches. Everything here is a systems approach, right? Everything's systems, as I mentioned really early in the lecture. And so, yeah, you got this idea of neoclassical economics, which is very popular, and we are trying to move in this lecture towards discussing ecological economics. And the goal here with ecological economics is to recognize that not all resources are equally valuable, all right? And that substitutes aren't always the same, and that depleting certain resources isn't acceptable for our overall quality of life. All right? And also recognizing that there are many resources supplied by a healthy functioning ecosystem. Therefore, maintaining the healthy functioning ecosystem needs to have value assigned to it. All right? So, in ecological economics, there are discussions of, hey, what about hitting steady state economy? All right? Where we move away from the goal being constant growth and instead towards stabilization. And if you remember from our discussion in week 1, 2, 3, whenever it was, we talked about the logistic growth model for populations and how populations tend to follow this natural growth curve where eventually they reach a carrying capacity. So you've got a small population, and over time it hits this point of rapid, almost, what could be exponential growth. But instead of following this exponential curve, populations stabilize around a carrying capacity, and that's essentially what ecological economics is recognizing and trying to move towards, is we don't want to be an R-selected species, we want to be a K-selected species. Because what do R-selected species do? Well, they boom, they bust, and they colonize new areas that open up to them, new habitats. They're disturbance adapted, right? They need another patch to open up. Another plot of unexploited land needs to become available. But this is the globe. Yes, please.
In microbiota, they often kill their host, give them enough, freedom.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and if you have R-selected species and you don't let them, and you don't have other species to compete with them, if they become dominant, they'll just boom and then hit zero. And we want to avoid that by instead hitting our boom and then stabilizing around carrying capacity. So the idea is to hit more of a steady state economy, stabilize, become a K-selected species. All those characteristics can be applied to human populations if you want, Do you want to be R-selected or do you want to be K-selected? With different life history patterns. Awesome. So when you read Cradle to Cradle has a lot of the principles that are covered in ecological economics. I'm going to say it a third time. I'm not an economist. So what did I do when I knew this lecture was coming? I watched some stuff of some other lectures about ecological economics. I read a couple chapters about ecological economics and did some, online, I looked at some Wikipedias. And, it's so my level of understanding of the nuances of this field, that's about where I'm coming at you from. But I will tell you that it is approachable, okay? If you want to understand the ecological economists, their goals are relatively simple that they propose, all right? It's usually stabilizing, increasing the use of renewables, valuing the ecological processes, valuing ecosystem services, and they have an openness to integrating that understanding into markets as they currently operate. So something like cap and trade, something like carbon credits, these integrate into the current functioning market, right? They don't require a complete overhaul, and that's where the ecological economist really comes in. All right, sick. So one of the goals that we could talk about in ecological economics is internalizing costs, all right? The the forest won't write you a bill. You know, they won't bill you for the damage. The watershed won't write you a bill when it gets depleted. The lake won't write you a bill when it gets contaminated. So all of these costs can be externalized. Maybe the other country where you get all your cadmium from, maybe they write you a bill, but because of the disparity in the economies, the bill is negligible for your interests where you operate. Okay? So you're externalizing all of these costs. The cost should be higher if we're valuing the impact on the environment. So in ecological economics, that's what they're usually talking about when they discuss externalized costs. You're having a massive negative impact on the environment, but you're finding a way to not reap the negative, to not receive the negative consequences of that by externalizing it. So in ecological economics, you try to internalize those costs and bring them back into whoever is imposing the costs. All right? So one way that you have to do this if you're integrating into modern markets is determine the monetary value of ecosystem services. And here's some estimates of externalized costs of coal power. So how much do you pay for coal power? That number is consistent here. And these are 3 different sets of estimates meant to show what are the other costs that aren't covered by paying for the coal power. Because if you can get coal power for under the cost that it actually costs, that effectively subsidizes utilizing coal power. You see, it's like if corn is very, very cheap, you're going to find a lot of uses for corn because there's a high supply of it, right? So here we go. Some categories of externalities, essentially, is what this figure is useful for. We've got some small federal subsidies for mining and power generation relative to the environmental and health costs of mining it and transporting it, all right? The illness and fatalities from emissions, the climate impacts. How do you value these things? It's kind of difficult to evaluate, all right? There's this project of the UN that attempts to estimate these actual monetary values and give them a number, So you can sort of see the idea here from the ecological economist's perspective. Make the cost of using coal power this. That way, you're actually paying for all of the impacts of accessing the coal, generating the electricity, transporting it to you. Okay? You get the idea. It's a pretty straightforward concept. Are there always substitutes? I mean, I don't think I have to tell you that no, there's not always substitutes for every single resource, okay? This is sort of the cycle that we were discussing a moment ago of you find a resource, you use it all up, and then as the supply gets low enough, there's still a demand for that resource, so the replacement is found. And you just keep on cycling and keep on cycling, and don't worry about it. There'll always be more. That's why it's called more. Remember? All right. Good. So yeah, is resource scarcity an issue? Yes. Are there always substitutes? No. So we talk about oil, and there's natural gas, there's wind, there's solar. For labor as a resource, there's mechanization and automation, all right? To find a new source of labor as a resource here, all right? Yeah, and then this big thing, if you can say something is substitutable, it's not usually considered indispensable, right? If you say, well, we don't need to worry about labor because we can automate everything, we can mechanize everything, okay? Well, then all of a sudden, labor is not indispensable, and labor is a resource that you can use up and then move on to the replacement. You just keep churning out of it, and compensating less and less and less for labor. And then eventually, once the people in that who are providing that labor stop providing that labor, you shift over, all right? Which is something that will never happen for us, right? We'll be fine, okay? Oil with natural gas, wind, and solar. Understandable, right? These are considered as equivalent, or these are replacements to that oil. Good. Let's move on to ecosystem services. What things does the ecosystem provide for us? Okay? What does a healthy, functioning ecosystem provide that we can recognize and try to conserve? Well, as with most things, researchers, specialists, those who study or participate in the field aggressively or in depth have broken it conveniently into multiple categories, which is nice and handy for the classroom, because now I can just show you like a table, and I'm like, just read the table. All right. Anyways, 4 different classes: regulation, provision, supporting or preserving, and then aesthetic or cultural benefits. Some of them are straightforward, like aesthetic and cultural benefits, at least insofar as understanding what the class of ecosystem services is, not maybe so much in understanding how much value we put on it. So we've got regulation, okay? Functioning ecosystems can regulate and attempt to mitigate massive fluctuations in conditions. So we're talking about regulation of global temperature. We're talking about regulation in a healthy soil of different compounds in the atmosphere. We're talking about regulation of the concentration of, I'm just going to say things, in water. As the water moves through a soil, it can be regulated, all right? So regulation sort of provides us a little buffer from massive changes, which we are not good at weathering. You know, the living things aren't really great at weathering massive, unexpected changes. Recovery can happen, but if they become too frequent, it becomes a problem. So, regulation helps to minimize those massive changes and hopefully reduce their frequency as well. And all that stuff about, you know, what are we good at weathering and which species succeed when disturbances become too drastic or too frequent, they're all basic ecological findings, all right, and basic ecological principles. We're just applying ecology to humans and to the field of economics. Okay. Space. Provide space and suitable substrates. Provide land, provide good soil. Provision. You're providing things. Healthy ecosystems also produce certain resources, all right? Healthy ecosystems produce food. They produce fresh water. They produce oxygen. They produce fodder for animals. They can make fuels. They can make fertilizers, building materials, and industrial inputs. But they produce things. There are outputs of a healthy, functioning ecosystem that can be accessed, and if the access rate isn't too drastic, then you can maintain that, right? Also supplying of, you know, aesthetic, spiritual, historic, cultural, artistic, scientific, educational opportunities, information, all right? We're at Cal Poly Humboldt, and one of the things that we always say in recruitment materials, right, is that you get to have your lab outside. You know, you're living in an area where you get to see all these ecological principles in operation. So that's one of the examples of like an educational opportunity. Yes?
This might seem like a dumb question, but are these
No.
all things that ecological economics does? Just like the functions of...
Oh, great question. Actually, yeah, very solid. So this is a way to, we've talked about ecosystem services in the abstract, and I think the basic ecosystem services definition is it works pretty well.
Okay.
But it just says, you know, hey, a functioning ecosystem provides things, and we want to value those things. This is just a way to break that down into categories of things that the ecosystem provides. So these are ecosystem services categories or classes. Does that answer it?
Yeah.
Awesome. And so ecological economics seeks to recognize these and provide and assign a monetary value to them, essentially.
Okay.
Yes?
Who did you say provided the classes and general definitions of ecosystem services?
Oh, yeah, yeah. The group, okay, so there are, yeah, this project of the UN, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity Project. But if you if you look at that group, it's had like 4 different names, and it's been around doing a bunch of different things, and you know, and also there are other groups that have participated in defining these classes, and then some of them are can be different between even different ecological economics like sources, like textbooks and things. So yeah.
I was just asking because I feel like there would be groups of people who would define ecosystem services differently.
100%.
But
100%.
getting rid of the last of aesthetic and cultural.
Yeah. Oh
is a
yeah.
big one.
Absolutely.
So I was just wondering who.
Oh. Yeah. And different groups, even different groups that accept the value of ecosystem services may discount certain classes and favor other classes. 100%, right? I think I might even have that in a slide somewhere, which would be so great. It always feels good when that happens. Let's see if I put it in. Okay. Figures like this, I don't know. I put this in the PowerPoint, I didn't feel great about it. I'm like, look at this figure. It says, hey, coral reefs provide this many dollars in ecosystem services per hectare per year. It's, I think, too simplifying. The real important thing is that, I'll be honest, is that every few slides is a picture or a figure. Because if I don't have a picture or a figure every few slides, the PowerPoint is dismal. So this figure is related to this, but what does it really tell us? It tells us that some people think that ecosystem services from coral reefs are valued at this much per year. But is every coral reef providing the same value in ecosystem services? Is every tropical forest providing the same value in ecosystem services? It's a massive generalization, but it provides it sort of explains like, hey, they could rank these. And now we could say, oh, open oceans don't actually provide that much per hectare per year. So if we're gonna do a project, we should get rid of the oceans, pave them. Yeah, you know?
A Walmart would go great.
I was gonna say you could probably put like 20 Starbuckses, like just in a line.
And a Dollar Tree.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It'll never happen. It'll never happen. Yeah. So how do we determine any of these costs? What's the principle behind determining these values? And the term is replacement costs. All right? That's the term that's used when you're explaining where these sort of estimates come from. How much would it cost for us to replace all those ecosystem services? Does that make sense? Now, of course, this implies that this cycle is going to work forever and that there's always a substitute, okay? Which, you know, I probably agree there's not. Always, not always. All right? So we've got an estimate. People like numbers. Here's a number. $30 to $170 trillion per year globally provided by ecosystem services. Or it would cost $30 to $170 trillion if there were no ecosystem services. But we wouldn't have to really worry about that, about paying that bill, okay? Because there are ecosystem services that we can't effectively substitute. All right? Cool. I mean, you can think about trying to do it. You could think about like, well, really what we need to do is have a system for taking solar energy and fixing it into high energy organic molecules. So technically, we just convert it into electricity, and then use that to run a lab to make glucose, protein, fat, and then make that into like a sludge and provide it, you know? Or pack it into a nice little, you can put it into a nice pack and make it into cubes. You all watch Snowpiercer? I thought those bricks looked pretty good. I don't know. Anyway, so there's that. Let's talk about the tragedy of the commons. So when I was a student, I was in like my junior year of a botany degree, and I went home and my stepdad wanted to talk about like what I was learning, and he was like, "So what did you think of like the tragedy of the commons?" And I was like, "Oh, what's that?" And I realized like, oh, this might be a blind spot in some classes. It's something that hopefully you heard about. I mean, honestly, hopefully you heard about it in high school, but I sure as heck didn't, you know? And then everybody just assumed that I'd heard about it somewhere else. Another class covered tragedy of the commons. So maybe this is the class where we talk about tragedy of the commons. Here's the concept. You've got a community. There's a big communal space, all right, in the center of the community. And everybody's allowed to utilize that big space. Let's say it's a pasture, all right? So everybody in town can use that pasture for grazing. Now, each individual could receive a larger benefit if they added an additional animal. But that would deplete grazing, if the grazing land and the resource, if everybody added an additional animal. But everybody needs additional income. Everybody just is going to say, I'll do it, but my neighbors shouldn't do it. It'll be okay. I really need it, so I'm going to put 2 more sheep on there. And the neighbor says the same thing, and the neighbor says the same thing. And, oh, they really shouldn't be doing that. They don't really need the extra 2 sheep. But the tragedy is that everybody wants to realize the maximum profit from the land, and therefore the land gets depleted and used up. Yes? Exactly. Give coercive power to the government or privatize the resource. And then the industry will take care of that resource and you rent land on the commons. And then that land will be governed correctly by the industry. Yeah. And now there are plenty of examples of a common space being utilized effectively. All right? The tragedy of the commons is not universal. All right? It is not just accepted wisdom. And that's what my stepfather back then, when I was a young fellow with eyes aglint, you know, and full of wonder, that's what he wanted to talk about, was like, well, what do you really think about it? Do you really think it's impossible for a community to manage an open access resource like this? You know? But I didn't know what the heck tragedy of the commons meant, so we could never have the conversation. You know? So, yeah, Garrett Hardin, tragedy of the commons. Everybody's gonna do this. No one cares about their neighbors. No one cares about the resource at all. So just let the government take control of it, and they'll manage it because they've got everybody's best interests at heart. All right? Obviously. Yeah. Yeah. It's a very old idea. Yeah. But it's still referenced commonly. You'll hear people saying, oh, it's a classic tragedy of the commons thing. You know? So this is still read as like, yeah, it's referenced in pop culture, and it's still a like foundational reading. So you understand the tragedy of the commons, so that you can understand, hopefully, the next step of the tragedy of the commons doesn't always happen, and we don't have to give all power over these open spaces to larger bodies. Community level management works very effectively in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I guess it's like a philosophical dilemma.
Yeah, but it can lead to serious changes in practices, you know? If you're considering how to manage communal spaces, and if you're at any level of government, you're like, what are we gonna do with that pasture land, you know? If you've read Tragedy of the Commons and nothing else, you go, well, we gotta manage it, all right? But if you've gone next to the next level and like considered more things, maybe you think about different frameworks for community management. But it does end up being an actual implemented philosophy, right? It's a realized philosophy. So it is a philosophical question, but a lot of conservation starts that way, and then you figure out how to make it work with, you know, laws and regulations and stuff like that. Yeah. I just don't think he liked people very much. You know? Like, yeah, my neighbor's a jerk. My neighbor keeps using all the hot water in the morning. And that's how everybody is, you know? I feel that way, you know, sometimes when I was in an apartment and my neighbor was always noisy. I was like, this is a tragedy of the commons situation. So there's plenty of examples of open access systems that have, or communal resources, okay, that are managed by smaller scale cooperatives. There's even coastal fisheries, okay, that aren't tightly regulated. And if everybody went out and caught the maximum number of fish that they possibly could along the coast, the fish supply would be depleted. And there's no body that's imposing limits on them necessarily, okay? Like, you can't go out and fish today. But there's a community understanding that we can't go out to fish today, all right? Or we can't bring in that many fish, or we need to not catch the biggest ones, and then it's enforced on a community level. Now, the real message of the communal property resources topic is you need there to be a sense of community in the people who are managing, in the people who are accessing the resource. You need some basic characteristics of successful communal resource management systems. And this is where we will come back to on Friday, all right? And this is just a list of commonalities that have been noted about successful communal resource management systems. And a lot of them tie back to you feel a sense of community with the people also accessing the resource, and you don't want to screw over the next generation of people accessing the resource because you also feel a sense of community with them. So that's where we'll come to on Friday on a message of hope, all right? I look forward to seeing you all then. Don't forget your standard stuff, annotated bibliography discussion. Have a great rest of your day. We're in week 10. We're going to get through it. All right.